Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November webinar with Skip Simpson. And today we're going to be talking about liability issues in suicide care and a lawyer's informed experience by lived expertise. I'm Rosie Bowder. I want to share a little bit about United Suicide Survivors International. We're a nonprofit organization that views lived experience and expertise as fundamental to having conversations around suicide and preventing suicide. One of many ways that we do that is by our monthly webinars like this. The other programs that we offer and resources that we offer include our storytelling course, which is available on our website. And I'll be able to drop a link. And Jess is also dropping a link in our chat, as well as our workplace national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention, which you can also find on our website. A few housekeeping notes. This will be recorded. We have everybody muted. While we would love to have lively conversation during all of our webinars, we will have more time, dedicated time at the end for conversation and questions. And you're also welcome to drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas.
Well, awesome. Thanks, Rosie. And thanks again for everybody who's joining in with us today. It is my pleasure now to introduce my friend and dear colleague, Skip Simpson, otherwise known as the suicide lawyer. Skip is bringing to us many, many decades of expertise serving families that have lost loved ones to suicide in legal cases. And he's going to share some of that, what families should know, and also what providers should know about legal liability issues and suicide. I am proud to serve on the board of the American Association of Suicidology with Skip, and I've gotten to know him over the years for that shared passion around suicide prevention and advocating for people with lived experience. And so with that, I will turn it over to Skip. Welcome.
Thank you, Sally. I very much appreciate it. I still am amazed about how you do everything that you do. But thank you for allowing me to share information about concepts from a medical malpractice trial lawyer's perspective, in particular, a plaintiff's perspective, where I represent families. But when you are a trial lawyer, you have to look at everything that goes on from everyone's perspective. And that certainly qualifies me for being able to be 100% informed by lived experience, because not only am I talking about my own lived experience in the past when I've been overwhelmed by issues, and being prior military, you think of everything as a way to try to solve an issue. So there's that. When I was doing organized crime narcotics, I had to get into the mind of the cartel and how do they think and what makes them tick. Usually that answer is easy, it's money. But we're always trying to think, at least I am, of what are people thinking about? We review about 80 to 100 suicide fact patterns yearly, and we accept about 6 cases for litigation. And what I think about is when people call me, is what are they thinking about? Who is it that, usually it's a loved one that has called up because they've lost someone to suicide. And what's going on in their mind. I think about, if I accept that case, even if I don't accept that case, what was going on in the mind of the person who ended up dying by suicide, really in that final hour or that final day or two. What was going on in the mind of the provider who was monitoring, or should have been monitoring, someone at risk for suicide? What was going on in that person's mind, and who are they working for, and what was the supervisor of that person thinking about? Is this something that when they come into work, for example, at a hospital or a outpatient clinic, are they really thinking about their clinicians? I mean, not their clinicians, but are they thinking about their patients and their clients. That's what they should be thinking about. That should be their only focus. And the reason why I like doing these kinds of things is to try to take out of the equation worrying about litigation. Because if you're worrying about, am I going to get sued? If you're worried about litigation, that means you're not focused on the needs of your patient. And the needs of your patient are paramount. They are where you are because they need help. They need hope. And they can quickly spot if your mind is not on them. And if your mind is not on them, that may be the last straw, that they thought they were going to get some hope from you, and they didn't. And suicide ebbs and flows. People are ambivalent about suicide. They're trying to figure out, is this something I should do or not do? And so they're reaching for everything. So part of the learning objectives that I wanted to address today are the concepts of confidentiality, which works for the patient, loved ones, and clinicians. So when I think of confidentiality, usually what I think about when I hear the word HIPAA is that is yet another reason why people die from suicide, because of the concept of confidentiality and the healthcare provider not truly understanding what HIPAA means, what confidentiality means, and it ends up being a barrier to effective care. There are going to be times, obviously, when things need to be confidential. For example, if you're treating a teenager and you have a parent that is one of the real problems, and either through abuse, physical or sexual or whatever, of course, it's extremely important that confidentiality is there, and the person that is your patient that's talking to you understands that what they say is confidential. But one of the things I recommend to healthcare providers is to have an effective treatment team. Is in the very first session or two, is to get your patient or your client to understand that you're there to help them, that you're sincerely there to help them, that you very much care for them, and that you want to do everything you can do to help them survive and have a better life and move on to the next day. One of the ways to do that is to try to get the patient to agree that it would be helpful if there were parents or loved ones that were a part of the treatment team. Essentially, that or any significant other that's a part of the treatment team. And so in that way, and when you're explaining that to them, have them understand that in order to do that, that they're going to need to sign something that says, that's okay. I would certainly like to have my loved one, my significant other, my parent or my child or whoever on the treatment team so we can work together to get this done. Because they need to know that this treatment is going to work. And so that's how, you work towards, as a therapist, getting them to waive confidentiality. And if you use that word waive confidentiality, all of a sudden barriers come up in their brain of, I don't want to waive anything, but you've got to be able to use it in such a way that you are waiving confidentiality, but they totally understand that they're waiving confidentiality, but in a way that I want your mom or dad to be a part of this treatment team. And in that way, I think it's going to be much more successful, your treatment and care. And there are ways to do that, but we don't have enough time in 45 minutes really to get through all of that. Another one of the learning objectives is what if you have to go if a patient has to go to a psychiatric facility, what is the appropriate observation level if hospitalization is required for patient safety? And there's going to be only one treatment level or an observation level that's going to be safe. And that's either line of sight observation level or 1-to-1. What often happens in hospitals that people are put on every 15-minute watch. And as I will address in this presentation, why that's not safe. There are also things that patients and loved ones should rightfully expect from their healthcare providers, and what not only should they expect, but deserve when receiving care from a healthcare provider. And a really good healthcare provider wants to do that. You rightfully should expect that people are going to be busting their tail to try to help you, that they're really there to help you, that they're not so busy that they don't have time for you. And if a healthcare provider doesn't have enough time to help that client, they need to get help. They need to talk to someone so that they can, like if you're on the staff at a hospital and there's only 3 healthcare providers for 25 patients, for example, that's not going to be enough to watch people who've come into that hospital that are high risk for suicide. They only come into hospitals when they're at high risk for suicide. And so that's the only safe observation level. And again, I will cover that. And I will try to explain liability issues in suicide care. When lawyers ask me what I do in suicide cases, they don't understand who it is that I sue and what the violations are of patient safety. What are the patient safety rules, which are the same things as standards of care? What is it that if they violate that there is a problem from a point of view of litigation? So Bubba and Babette ask the same questions, and I'm not being derogatory there. I consider myself a Bubba, but Bubba and Babette are who I refer to as people that are being selected for jury duty, and they have had their days disrupted to come down and make a decision on whether or not someone is liable for malpractice or not. And so I have to dial Bubba and Babette into what we're really doing. So my answer when I'm answering lawyers about what do I do, it starts with an inpatient suicide as an example. And when I finish my explanation, everyone gets it. Experts tell us that individuals at risk for suicide who are being monitored in hospital facilities need to be constantly under direct visual surveillance as a significant deficiency in the amount of oxygen reaching the brain can be rapidly induced when a patient hangs himself or otherwise manages to stop breathing. So when you're in a patient's in a room in a hospital, they're there because they're at high risk and they're thinking in that room, how is it that I can die? And the number one way people die in psychiatric hospitals is by hanging. So it takes between 30 to 180 seconds of oxygen deprivation to lose consciousness. And once you've lost consciousness, there's nothing you can do there to change your mind or try to save yourself. You can't, you're unconscious. At the 1 minute mark, brain cells start dying. This is from hanging. At 2 minutes, neurons suffer more extensive damage and lasting brain damage becomes more likely. At 5 minutes, death becomes imminent. At 10 minutes, even if the brain remains alive, a coma and lasting brain damage and death are almost inevitable. Most observation levels are set at every 15 minutes. So that's a dangerous observation level. And the reason why it's a dangerous observation level is that 15 minutes isn't going to address the issue of the loss of consciousness, brain damage, and death. It just isn't. And I've asked, when speaking to 300 to 400 psychiatric forensic psychiatrists in one presentation I gave in Arizona, I asked, why 15 minutes? Where did 15 minutes come from? Why that? And no one could answer the question as to why 15 minutes are selected. Finally, a couple of psychiatrists came to the microphone and said, it's because what we already by now know. It's about money. It's about staffing. And so there's just not enough staff to watch everyone that's on that unit who's at high risk for suicide. There is no more difficult way for a person to die from a grieving point of view than from from a sudden, unexpected, and preventable death. And we all stress it, that suicide is preventable. It is not just something that you say, it is preventable. When teaching trial lawyers about suicide cases, I cover first myths surrounding suicide. And if healthcare providers believe these myths, patient safety is compromised. Second, I talk to them about case selection. How do you pick cases? And the reason why I'm telling this group about how we go about selecting cases is so that you know how to keep out of the trap, the malpractice trap. So case selection means that we're looking at the defendant's conduct, usually a healthcare provider, a hospital, emergency department, or a prison or a jail, and then random victims that might be involved in the attempted suicide. And then the second thing is, why should the community care? Who cares if people are dying by suicide? We have to address that with people that are coming in to sit on juries. Why do I care? You know, I've never had a family member that's died by suicide, and I'm not thinking about suicide. So why should I care? I just want out of here. I've got to go to work. The next thing is that we consider is system failures, both outpatient and inpatient. And system failures mean that if you're talking about a hospital, you're talking about the whole system. You're talking about the psychiatrist, you're talking about communications, you're talking about staffing, you're talking about appropriate assessments for suicide, you're talking about the environment of care, all the things that have to be working together in order to prevent a suicide. And then I talk generally about thoughts about suicide cases. So the first thing I'd like to talk about in terms of case selection, in terms of what I tell lawyers they need to be thinking about, are the myths regarding suicide. And I don't have any intention to insult my audience. When deposing psychiatrists, clinicians, and corporate representatives of hospitals, I hear them all the time relating these myths. This is why I did, or this is what I think, this is why I did what I did. And one of the most frequent myths that I hear is the natural fear that asking about suicide will somehow give the patients ideas about suicide. And I explained to these lawyers that, you know, by this time, they have already been thinking about suicide. By the time they reach healthcare, suicide is already on their mind. You have to ask about suicide, and it doesn't put the idea in their mind. Another myth is that suicide for some is inevitable, that it's just going to happen. And if a healthcare provider has that concept in their mind, then they think they don't have to work quite as hard to save the person because it's going to happen anyway. And the whole concept of healthcare is to make sure it does not happen. So what we try to do is make sure that the clinicians are competent, that they know what they're doing, And if they're in the outpatient scenario, that what they're doing is making sure they see the patient frequently enough that they're properly assessing for suicide. And assessing for suicide isn't some, are you suicidal day, or even worse, you're not suicidal, are you? It's first you have a screening assessment to find out if someone has suicide on their mind. And then if they do, then you get into a systematic suicide assessment, which is a deeper, more comprehensive assessment. And you're asking questions in such a way to make people talk about what they don't want to talk about. This is a concept that I learned in the Department of Justice doing organized crime narcotics, trying to get people to confess to crimes, to say things that will cause them to say what they don't want to say. Doctors have to do this all the time when it comes to alcoholism, when it comes to sexual abuse, when it comes to wearing seatbelts, all kinds of things. So a question would be, for example, you would say, when someone comes into my office, if you're a clinician and they're depressed or have anxiety, that, it's rarely a time that someone comes into my office and they haven't been thinking about suicide. And you just say it in a calm kind of a way. And then when's the last time that you thought about suicide? Now the subject's easily addressed, and now you get into what's going on in their brain about suicide. There are a lot of other techniques that a great book to read is any book by Sean Christopher Shea on the assessment of suicide and how to interview patients. Another myth is people often die by suicide without warning, out of the blue. That's a myth. It is rare to have an individual with no risk factors that dies out of the blue. If that is true, then for the lawyer, there's no foreseeability in a case. If there's no foreseeability of suicide, then there's no case. And when I get to the issue of foreseeability, I want to distinguish between foreseeability and predicting suicide. Clinicians don't have to predict suicide. They can't predict suicide. Every time I utter a general comment like that, there are going to be some exceptions, but as a general rule, you can't predict it. But the job of a clinician who is assessing is to anticipate if someone's at risk for suicide. So if they are at risk for suicide, then you can anticipate that in the outpatient setting. Then you're going to need to be spending more time with that individual. You're going to be needing to give them more hope. You're going to be needing to increase the frequency of your visits. And if things get so bad or so dangerous, there's going to be some times that you have to admit someone to a psychiatric facility to be protected. And that all means that you can anticipate suicide occurring if a intervention is not taken to prevent it. Another myth is people who really want to die will find a way. It won't help to try to stop them. But that's a myth. That goes against the whole concept of suicide prevention. We are going to try to help patients find a way other than suicide. We're trying to get to that side of the person who wants to live, not the side that wants to die. So we know that people who are thinking about suicide are suffering from depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, all kinds of things. And these diseases are all highly treatable illnesses, and symptom relief almost always eliminates the need for patients to just give up. So I have high regard for people in the mental health field and doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists and clinicians and anyone who's in the healthcare including guards in prisons, who are doing their best to try to keep people from dying from suicide. So there's always a way as long as there's hope, and hope is what it's about in suicide prevention. Finally, the expression people who, well, we talked about that, people really want to die or going to find a way, that's just misconceived. Also, there's a myth about people leaving a suicide note that explains the nature of their act. Factually, I think it's true that about 15 to 25% of those who die by suicide leave a note. With all statistics, there's always some debatable area, but the takeaway from that is not so much the percentages, but it's the idea that most people don't leave suicide notes. Now, when it comes to how to case selection and how to think about that, I'd like to give you a vignette that I want to go through. That the victim is a 35-year-old man without any prior psychotic or depressive episodes ever. He's never seen a counselor or taken any antidepressants. He's in middle management. The man has a major stressor. He's lost the love of his life. She dumped him, and which he was able to overcome until several months later, when he found out that it was his best friend that was sleeping with his mate. And this sent him over the top. So he took a number of non-prescription drugs, drank a half a quart of tequila, and found himself wandering in the street outside the house, naked, screaming her name. Neighbors called the police. The police did not arrest him, but simply said, "You need to go to the hospital." You hope that police officers, and they're getting better and better at their training on how to help people that are being overwhelmed with mental health issues. So anyway, he obliges to the police. He gets his clothes and an overnight bag, and off to the hospital he went. The hospital properly triaged him as a high suicide risk, but contrary to their written policy, they did not remove all dangerous instrumentalities from his person or possessions, did not put him in a hospital gown, and did not post an aide of the same sex to monitor him every second, including when he went to the bathroom. As the ED arranged to transfer him to a psychiatric hospital, he started sobering up and began to plead with the ED staff not to transfer him because it would ruin his career. The ED said they were obligated to transfer him, and the patient pulled out a .38 pistol out of his overnight bag and shot himself in the head. This raises all kinds of issues, but one of the issues it raises from a lived experience point of view is when the person is begging not to go. This triggers a situation where the staff ought to have a competent mental health provider reassess the patient comprehensively in a systematic way to not just blow off this patient who says, "I'm not going to kill myself." We all know that just because someone says, "I'm not going to kill myself," that's not the end of the inquiry. Often people who say that they're going to kill themselves as soon as they get an opportunity to do it by talking their way out of an ED. But that's why it has to be a competent person that's doing a reassessment. And we don't have time to get into how to do all that, but I would recommend the Suicide Prevention Resource Center Consensus Guide for emergency departments. It's a Suicide Prevention Resource Center, consensus guide for emergency departments. That should be consulted and followed. Now, when you read that consensus guide, it's good for anyone who wants to think about what they ought to be doing when they have someone at risk for suicide, whether it's in the outpatient scenario, the ED, or wherever it is. Now, another thing that we think of that I teach lawyers what to think about when they're handling suicide cases is the defendant's conduct. And so that would be, again, to be either the hospital, a psychiatrist, or clinician to look at their conduct. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? And I talk, of course, to the person who has called me, the loved one, and find out what they know about it. And I also look at the medical record. And this is a good time for a risk management comment, is that's what we look at, our medical records. And so you need to chart what you were thinking about as a clinician. You know, what caused you to make the decision that this person should be hospitalized? What caused you to make the decision this person should not be hospitalized? What caused you to make the decision that you were only going to see a suicidal patient once every 3 weeks? Why? You may have a really good reason, but just tell us. If you don't tell us and someone dies from suicide and you say you're only going to see someone every 2 or 4 weeks who is at risk for suicide, I'm going to be looking for some explanation for that. The decision to violate patient safety rules regarding contraband and monitoring can result in random victims being injured or killed. As experts, you're permitted to explain the random victims during a discussion of the purpose of safety rules. Why is it that you have this particular safety rule of means restriction, for example? When you are a family member, should you expect that mental health providers in the emergency room are going to be asking about means restriction? And the answer to that is, yeah, you should expect that. Should you expect out of them when they say you need to check for guns at home, that you get more detailed about what, should the healthcare provider get more detailed than just check for guns at home? The answer to that is yes. That's when you start thinking like a DEA agent, and you're thinking about looking for a contraband at home. You think about all the places that a gun or, with the DEA's viewpoint, drugs could be. You need to be thinking about the car. You need to be thinking about the glove compartment in the car, every place that anyone could hide a means to die by suicide needs to be explained to the family member. That when someone's being discharged from a hospital, for example, means restriction is very important. You have a right to expect that the healthcare provider understands that. Excuse me. Community survival. That's another thing that we look at. Community survival issues. Why should the community care about the outcome of the case? When Bubba and Bubette come in to think about someone that's died by suicide, why should they care? What is the importance of enforcing safety rules of keeping dangerous items away from people at risk for suicide? If a safety rule is to have any future application, then you can't pick and choose when the rule is enforced. It must be enforced constantly. And anytime you're talking about suicide prevention, you're always talking about monitoring, particularly in hospitals, but even in an outpatient situation. How much time can elapse without me keeping an eye on this person or talking to this person and enforcing hope? Those things always have to be on the mind of any healthcare provider that is dealing with someone at risk for suicide. The reptile part of our brain, the neurological burglar alarm, is blaring when it knows how important preventing suicide is to the survival of Bubba and his gene pool and the community. That's how we explain to people why they should care about suicide, because suicide could impact you, it could impact your loved ones, it could impact the people on your block. Monitoring has to do with every floor of the hospital. You can't go on a floor of a hospital that monitoring's not involved. The departments of the hospital, the question is what departments of the hospital must adhere to the rule of adequate monitoring. All departments, the obstetrics floor, the cardiology floor, the pulmonology floor, oncology floor, everything's involved with monitoring. And so if Bubba and Bubette think that someone's not monitoring their loved one in the emergency room, then that goes to the whole hospital. Now they're wondering about the whole hospital, and they're particularly worried about their own safety and the safety of their gene pool, which is a sort of a crass way of putting it, but they're always thinking about their mom and dad. They're thinking about their kids, their grandkids. That's who we're thinking about. There's also the rule of stop it next time. So if a suicide ever happens before, anywhere, anytime, any place, then it creates a duty for the hospital, the physician, the clinician to investigate that death as far as possible to fix it. The earlier event creates the absolute safety requirement to get in and figure out what went wrong. Now, the Joint Commission has rules that surround that issue of stop it next time. It's called the failure mode evaluation analysis. So that's something that hospitals do, and also anyone should do when they're thinking about preventing suicide. And that is, what can go wrong? You're always thinking about failure. What could go wrong in my hospital? Then after you think about the failure mode evaluation analysis, if you do have an incident, then you have another Joint Commission rule concept, and it's called root cause analysis. And so what you have a right to expect as a loved one is that when a root cause analysis is done, that it's done properly. I've not seen a root cause analysis done properly. When I'm able to get in to see those, which are very rare because they don't have to be disclosed, but sometimes they inadvertently get disclosed. There is not a good job on analyzing why someone was able to die in a hospital. And in terms of the failure mode, a lot of hospitals don't even have the failure mode evaluation analysis. So let me talk a minute about typical defenses that we see when we try these cases. And one of the things that we see is that suicide, the act of suicide, cuts off liability. It's called a superseding cause of a decedent's death. So, but if the suicide is foreseeable, and it's always going to be foreseeable if someone's in a hospital, or if it involves custodial care, and you hope that the prisoner, the person that's being detained, is receiving a psychiatric assessment, because most people that go into prisons, for example, are going to have mental health illnesses. And so they have to be assessed for suicide. So they're just almost exactly like a hospital, except you know the people in the hospital, the people in the penitentiary are going to likely be at risk for suicide just because of their circumstances. So if a suicide is foreseeable and involves custodial care or a defendant owes an affirmative duty to take reasonable steps to prevent suicide, suicide is never a superseding event. Another defense we hear all the time is he killed himself or she killed himself. So how is it that a clinician can be sued if it's the patient who died by suicide? He killed himself. How can that be? Well, suicide's not a choice. And then I use a metaphor that I've never had an original thought in my mouth. David Covington is the one who came up with this metaphor, who's a outstanding professional. He uses the chinning bar metaphor. So the idea is that if you think of a chinning bar and someone is on the chinning bar and he's holding on, and below him are these alligators just waiting for him to fall, the last thing someone wants to do is let go. They do not want to let go, because if they do, they're going to meet sudden death. So the metaphor is that you hope that someone comes along and takes that guy off, or that lady off the chinning bar, and helps them, gives them hope. If that happens, then the suicide is prevented. But if no one comes by, no one gives him hope, he can only hold on so long. And after a while, he lets go, not because he wants to die, but because he can't hold on anymore. And so this concept, if he killed himself, is when it's explained in court and when it's explained to survivors of suicide, it gives people some ease to know that the person just wasn't intent on killing themselves. It helps understand it better. The other concept is he denied being suicidal. Sally, am I getting towards the end?
There's a gazillion questions here, Skip. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that we want to leave some time for questions.
Okay, why don't we do that right? I am. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, lots of engagement over here and some debating too. So it's really interesting. So Jennifer Stuber from Washington State has a number of questions. One of her questions is, how do we flip the narrative from one of, quote, you're going to be sued for doing something, to one of, you're going to be vulnerable for being sued when you don't know what the standard of care is? I think right now, many clinicians are so afraid to help suicidal people because of this fear of being sued that they just refer, rather than bringing up their skill level and confidence by knowing what the standards of care are and getting trained in best practices. How do we flip the script?
Well, Jen Stuber is like you, an amazing lady. She has done so much for suicide prevention. And the way I suggest trying to flip that narrative is it starts off in our graduate schools. It starts off at the medical schools. And we start teaching people that the worst outcome that can happen in mental health is suicide. And so I know the reason why you decided to get into mental health is to help people. And so the way you help people is by being competent in addressing the underlying causes of suicide, knowing what to do, how to assess for suicide. And that is the narrative, is I'm here to help. That's what it's called, healthcare, helping people. So you start right there with that concept. And it's just like flying an airplane. One of the problems of flying an airplane is you might crash. Well, you do everything you can do to avoid crashing an airplane. There are just some jobs, if it's a policeman, there's going to be risk, but he's there or she's there to help the community. There's going to be risk in the military when you're going out to combat to fight for your country. You might die in that deal, but it's a noble profession. And one of the things that you're going to be getting, not having to do, but getting to do, is to help people that are at risk for suicide. And as a former military officer, if someone told me they were afraid of getting shot in war, I would tell them that you need to go do something else because this job's not for you. And it's the same thing in mental health. You know, if you get them off on the right thinking, they got into this thing because they wanted to help people. That's what my assumption is. And I have so much respect for them. So the changing the narrative starts with how they first start thinking about it when that teacher in the classroom first opens his or her mouth to talk about this. That's my thought.
Great. Desiree's stage was on, but she jumped off. And so I just want to summarize a couple of her comments. So one, she was concerned about the confabulation between suicidal person and mass murder. And also the fear that sometimes comes with the 24-hour round the clock surveillance, that is those kinds of things are, evoking fear, which makes it puts barriers between, the provider and really creating space for finding hope again. Constant 24-hour surveillance is hard if you're under that to find hope again. So I'm just wondering if you could address that tension.
Yeah, I would try. First of all, she is a real bright lady. Also, and has a lot of good thoughts, and she has been helpful to me in trying to think about the kinds of things that she raised. And that's, again, getting into their head. So if someone is fearful of bullying, first of all, they're not going to be on 24-hour constant observation unless they go into a psychiatric hospital. If they go into a psychiatric hospital, they're there to be protected. Again, in the beginning, is trying to, if I'm that person that's going into a psychiatric hospital to be protected, then I would sure like to have someone explain to me why I am there, okay? And that gets down to the systematic suicide assessment. When you're going through that assessment, tell me, why is it I should believe you that you don't want to die by suicide? Help me out here, because I really don't want to put you in a hospital. A hospital's not a safe place. I'm just going to be clear with that. We have there's always a debate on how many people die every day in a psychiatric hospital, but the guesstimates is somewhere between 6 and 8 a day. I don't know how reliable that statistic is because I've heard it debated by the Joint Commission. I just don't know. I've seen what they've had to say, but I'm getting off course. What I would want I'd want someone to tell me, I'd want someone to tell me if my wife is going into a hospital, what can be expected there in this facility. And if I get put on every line of sight observation level, why am I on that? The reason why you're on that is because you're here to be protected. And you're not going to be in this hospital probably any more than 3 to 4 to 5 days. But the idea is to get you better again. And then with continuity of care, get you out of this hospital, back into a therapy situation, and get you back into normal life. So the idea of healthcare, mental health care, is to get people into care, get them fixed, get them back into the game. That's what they want. That's what we want. That's what the law wants. Everyone wants that. And I hope I'm addressing her thoughts. Was there something else, Sally, that she said?
She just said that the connection between suicide and homicide suicide evokes a lot of fear in workplaces and in clinics and so forth. So again, it kind of makes people want to push away the suicidal person rather than coming alongside and finding ways to support.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, so you can't all the time. Sometimes you can argue with statistics, but not all the time. And when Thomas Joyner says something and he writes a book about it and backs everything up with, he says that if you can prevent a suicide, you're going to possibly prevent homicides. Everyone has to be educated on all of this. And so in the workforce, you have to have the entire workforce educated on that deal. So if you're feeling like you're at risk for suicide, you need to say something and speak up. So do your coworkers. They need to speak up. And it's not to be in a punitive way, it's to save everybody. And if we're not all pulling together or not all working on the same concept of preventing suicide, the contrary of that is just to be quiet, not to say anything. And that's deadly. If you don't say anything, it's just a deadly situation. And we hear this all the time after these workplace suicides and violence, that so-and-so knew something but never said anything because they were afraid HR was going to do something. Well, HR needs to be smart. They need to do something. Everyone needs to be protecting the work. We all need to be protecting each other. So I don't know how else to say that. I understand it, but we can reduce fear by becoming more knowledgeable as a country.
All right. Well, to that point, there's another question here about, sometimes people have fear around getting trainings or certifications because then maybe they're going to have more liability. Do the trainings and standards of care increase or decrease risk for people?
No, they don't. Okay. So that is a understandable notion, but if you had a pilot who just didn't want to learn how to fly the airplane for American Airlines, first of all, that pilot wouldn't get to be a pilot for American Airlines. You've got to, no matter what your job is, you have to do it competently. So here's the other side. Okay, you're a psychologist or you're a psychiatrist, and I deliberately didn't get any training because I didn't want to know anything about suicide because I might be getting sued. Well, trust me, you just got sued. And on top of everything else, you got into a profession that you knew there was going to be some risk of suicide. And you decided to not think about your patient, but instead to think about yourself. Am I right so far? Mm-hmm. Why didn't you go get this training? Well, I thought I was going to get sued. Well, so you were thinking about yourself. You can see that thinking is going to get you in a huge trap. So no, standards of care are there for a reason. We have, our moms and dads taught us standard of care. They said, son, when you go out in the front yard, don't get on the curb, okay? Don't get in the street. And if I keep doing that, little Skip had the back of his calf slapped, okay? That was back in the day when that was okay. But there are rules for everything. There's, and we have to be a civil society, and we can only exist together if we do have rules. That's what the whole concept of law is all about.
Great. Some questions about, say at a university setting where we do have professional licensed mental health providers, is the larger system, the university, also at risk for being sued in a suicide case? And what's the level of responsibility they have outside of that direct care?
They can be, and some of these questions are complicated just because of the various jurisdictions, various states, and some places, for example, if you have a university that is state run, for example, then there's going to be immunity issues there that's involved. But the way I like to approach these things is that it's not how can we avoid liability, it's how can we protect our students. And so we got to act as if that's the only thing that's on our mind and do what you can. Now, there are going to be some, and there have been cases where universities have been sued and big verdicts have come back. And it was because when you start breaking down the parts, it's a systemic issue. So you have a child that comes in, children to me, they're 18 and 19 years old, and they go into their clinician at the university and they're not properly assessed for suicide. And no one is mindful of the store, so to speak, and then a kid ends up dying from suicide. And what the parent says, well, I didn't know anything about that. And that's often the case. They didn't know anything about that. So then that gets back to this treatment team concept. Okay, now that clinician says, look, I really care about you. You're a student here. We love you. You're brilliant. We want to keep you alive for all kinds of reasons. But in order to do that, I need more people on the treatment team. Can you tell me someone who knows you better than anyone? You started off with a question like that. And who do you really trust? Is it okay if we get them on the treatment team? Because I just don't, I know you, I'm a professional. I've got a PhD or an MD and everything, but I don't know you as well as so-and-so does. And if we work together and they're part of the treatment team, then, this is going to work out for you. And this is going to work out for me because I love you and I want you to be taken care of. So you just take what makes sense. Most of this stuff is common sense. I get mad at the law for scaring the hell out of a lot of people. Part of it is that they don't understand what the law is, like HIPAA. But there are problems. I mean, I'm working with the Texas Bar Association right now to have an exception to the confidentiality rule for lawyers and clients, so that a lawyer who spots a suicidal issue can, without breaking confidentiality, talk to people to help save their lives, because their life now is more important in the fact that they aren't doing well on a business deal or a bankruptcy or a divorce or whatever. First of all, you got to save the life, and then you go to the other problems. And that, by the way, the Texas Bar is going to do that.
Thank you so much, Skip, for all of your comments with us today. And I am just going to close with a couple of slides. And as I do that, would you just tell people how they can get a hold of you? We had at least a dozen questions that we didn't get to. Can you let them know how they can reach you?
Me? Or did you address that to me?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Okay. So they can email me at ssimpson at ssimpson.skips. No, at ssimpson. I don't know how the hell they can get a hold of it.
Hold on, I can pull it up.
I have an email. It's ssimpson@skipsimpson.com. There you go. ssimpson@skipsimpson.com. And I welcome your emails to tell me, if you want to tell me I'm the stupidest person you ever met in your life, you will not be the first one. I am married.
All right. ssimpson@skipsimpson.com is correct, Skip. I just looked it up. So, and Jessica will put that in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who showed up today. Tremendous number of folks and really wonderful engagement and debate, which is so healthy for us to have in the chat. I really appreciate it. Please join us at United Survivors. We have these webinars monthly, and we're in all the places and social media, and we really encourage you to join the conversation. Next month's webinar will be with Sam Webb. If those of you don't know Sam, he is a force to be reckoned with. Coming from Australia, Sam will talk about making meaning after suicide loss. He lost a dear friend to suicide and has started an international revolution on really bringing on young people to champion suicide prevention. So come for a very inspiring talk next month with Sam Webb. Take care, everybody.